Previously on the Bus Inspectors podcast, the nation's historic fleet of 10,000 vintage buses and coaches. Why we love vintage buses.
Buses and coaches aren't just a static object.
You're sitting up there, you're route master, master of the road.
There's your interaction with the conductor.
People remember the colours of the buses if they're old enough, to remember what they were like in the 60s and 70s.
Not to mention the fantastic view that you can get from inside the bus as you travel along.
The changing priorities of the generations when it comes to heritage.
So this bus is a 2000 model, which makes it 24 this year. I am 4 years younger than the bus.
The old story is, of course, I remember going to school on that. Well, they didn't go to school on AEC Renaults, they went to school on Darts and Olympians and things.
These buses need to be preserved because they are what we're going to remember in 50 years' time,
And how the Bus Inspectors project to grade the nation's historic fleet could help us in the future.
If I have some worries about the future, is that we won't be able to save everything.
We want to be able to show the way they have evolved mechanically, operationally, and indeed how they've evolved within a social context to meet the needs of the passengers that they carry.
Working out which ones most deserve to be in collections for the future is a really sensible thing to do.
I've been a bus enthusiast ever since the day I opened my eyes. My first words were neither mama or papa, but STL.
The legendary Michael Dryhurst, one of the pioneers of UK bus preservation, who we'll be meeting and remembering in this episode of the Bus Inspectors podcast. These were the people who saved their pocket money and rescued so many of the old buses we treasure today.
Dad managed to find out who had bought the 6, and he had to meet somebody down a back street in Exeter who was a dealer, and that was back in 1957, and it's been in the collection ever since.
We'll also consider the first challenge that greeted those pioneers, one that constantly haunts bus preservation today. Where do you keep an old bus? From old barns...
Winkley was used for a pig store, actually. The shed was back in 1965.
To Brooklands.
We have moved from being a shed full of old buses. We're now a fully working museum with a shop and a kids area and an exhibition area and all the things you'd expect in a modern, up-to-date museum.
Later, we'll join the bus inspectors on their tour of museums and collections as they begin the mammoth task of grading the UK's 10,000 historic buses and coaches. And we'll share some of the dilemmas the bus inspectors will face, especially when it comes to what makes a bus authentic or not.
I think telling the story and putting it in context is more important than whether the livery is strictly appropriate.
Many of the nation's historic buses and coaches have spent more years in museums than they actually served on our street. Most would have faced the scrapyard long ago, were it not for the individuals and organisations which kept a close eye on them, tracked them down in later life, and raise the funds to buy and restore them. Today, there's a vibrant network of museums, societies, charities, and private individuals for whom collecting old buses is a pastime. But when did this all begin?
It started in 1956, and it slowly gained momentum when other people saw what we were doing.
Michael Dryhurst is a Golden Globe award-winning film producer and director, now 86 and living in Arkansas. Buses are his first love. Young Michael answered an advert in the April 1956 issue of Buses Illustrated magazine, seeking photographs of London buses. The advertiser had been one Prince Marshall, and their shared interest led Michael to meet Prince and his pal Ken Blacker.
They turned to me one day and said, "We're buying a bus." I was then 18 and nothing seemed impossible. I mean, at 18, nothing does seem impossible. And buying a bus, if you were a bus enthusiast, didn't seem anything out of the ordinary. The bus in question was a Cos T31, a 1929 AEC Regal 662, which had been converted from rear entrance to forward entrance, and London Transport was now prepared to sell it to us.
There was certainly strength to be found in numbers.
Prince and Ken gathered together some more people so that by about the time we bought it, in October of 1956, there was about 10 of us, and I remember paying £2 10 shillings then as my share.
These were pioneering steps for what we now know as bus preservation. As one step is usually followed by another, perhaps a second bus was inevitable. As we know, buses rarely turn up by themselves.
Both Ken and Prince were ardent admirers of Guildford, GILFORD products, and we learned of one with a company named Robson just outside Hexham in Northumberland. February 1957, we're all on a train heading up to Newcastle, where we get another train up to Hexham, and off go Prince and Ken to negotiate to buy the Guildford.
The group soon had a name, the Vintage Passenger Vehicle Society, VPVS, and it also had a growing fleet.
Subsequently, we got the Lion, another Guildford GW713, which Prince's son Sebastian now has, the ex-Leicester AEC renowned CBC 921, a Thornycroft UY something, which we bought from a blind school in Worcester and originally been with Tiffany's School in Kingston.
Bus preservation had exploded into being, albeit under the tight control of towing bars and trade plates. As bus operators became aware of a fledgling preservation movement, many were sympathetic to the cause. By 1965, Michael had decided to buy his own bus, an AEC Regent 1, which had been new to Brighton Corporation in 1939.
When we picked it up at the Lewis Road Works of Brighton Corporation, we just stuck trade plates on it, East Sussex trade plates, I think it was something like 451 AP, and drove it to Vick's Farm, where it was kept undercover in a Dutch barn. The price was £45 for the bus, £13 for the slave batteries and £2 for the slave tyres. Total 60 quid. That bus is now 85 years old.
From these routes grew several of our transport museums and collections. Among the more famous was the former Cobham Bus Museum, which has evolved today into the London Bus Museum at Brooklands. Its chairman is Leon Daniels.
The driving force sort of split two ways. Prince Marshall was especially interested in restoring and collecting pre-war vehicles, and Alan Olney and his brother Donald were more interested in post-war. So Alan and Don not only were the earliest pioneers for the Cobham Bus Museum, frankly they remortgaged their houses in order to provide some of the money for the property transaction to take place.
It was the start of an expensive journey, but the pioneers were ready to generate funds.
Alan became full-time at the old Cobham Bus Museum. He moved it into being a business. So increasingly he was buying vehicles and selling them. Lots of red buses going overseas to be tourist attractions, especially in America, where of course they're cute. Vehicles were coming to Cobham, were being painted, were being overhauled, were being shipped. I personally remember driving buses to the docks in the freezing cold and coming home with a set of trade plates under my arm.
Cobham Bus Museum grew and thrived.
That gave them a great base. And Alan was a great wheeler dealer, we would say, and he was buying things and selling them to others continuously. And that gave this museum its very early form of some sort of financial basis.
But in 1978, there came an unexpected blow.
Alan was tragically killed in a car accident that also killed his wife, Lynn, and it's commemorated in a plaque here in the museum. All of a sudden, the museum was left without their business leader. But a new generation of people came forward who took on Alan's work, and amazingly, the business continued, the restorations continued, the development of the site continued. But here what we have today is a tribute to what those early preservationists did, not only with their interest, but with their time and with their own money.
Bus preservation was emerging all over the UK. In the West Country, a schoolboy named Colin Shears was falling in love.
He used to travel with his mum down to Exeter on 6 of these Leyland Tiger TS8s with craven bodies. He'd make a note of each one that he rode on from the age of 5 in his diaries.
As his son Dan recounts, there may have been 6 favourites for Colin, but each one was an individual.
It got to the stage with them where he could recognise whichever vehicle was coming up the hill simply by the sound of it, with the gears and the various engine noises.
These sounds are from Colin's own tape recordings, which he made while riding on the vehicles. When the favourite Leyland Tigers were to be retired from service and possibly scrapped, there was a need for action.
He decided that he had to buy one of these buses when he left school. Exeter Corporation would not sell to private individuals, they'd only sell to businesses or bus breakers. So Dad managed to find out who had bought the 6, and he had to meet somebody down a back street in Exeter who was a dealer, and then purchase it off of them. And that was back in 1957.
A schoolboy dream had come true. But what would Colin Shears do with his Leyland Tiger?
He went to Cirencester Agricultural College. After he left school, he took the bus there, 66, and then took all of his fellow students in his class up to the Bullring auctions up in Scotland, which was an epic trip, and every year he'd rally the vehicle. I think he went on the first London to Brighton with it back in 1960. That was the vehicle that started the collection. Hasn't had any major restoration. It's been repainted a couple of times, and the seats have been done inside and mechanical jobs, but he certainly did a lot of miles with that vehicle.
Colin's ambition to collect led to many other purchases. In fact, many more.
A lot of the vehicles now, Dad did have a part in saving them and passing them on, and knowing that they go on to a good home to be restored. He was definitely a pioneer of the bus preservation scene.
This is the Bus Inspectors Podcast. It's brought to you by the National Association of Road Transport Museums, who are undertaking a project to grade the nation's historic buses and coaches. Later, we'll join the bus inspectors on their early visits to museums and collections and listen in to what's being said.
Leicester's had Gardner engines, whereas the South Yorkshire ones were Rolls-Royce.
Oh, right. I know which I'd have rather had.
And we'll get nostalgic about livery.
I'll always remember that vivid green of the side of the bus with the Greyhound logo running across the side of it as well.
But first,
storage is the bus preservationist's biggest problem. And it's a bigger problem for lots of reasons. There is the conditions under which they're kept, security, the risk of fire, people breaking in and stealing the aluminium or the batteries or whatever, and of course the cost.
Where can I keep my bus is a question most vintage bus owners have to ask themselves at least once in their preservation journey. Leon Daniels.
Quite a lot of people enter the world of preservation thinking their biggest headache is going to be the maintenance and the cost of the running of the bus. In fact, it's the cost and the finding of suitable storage, which, by the way, all the reasons I said, has to be suitable for the bus. It's also got to be quite near you, because there's no good living 200 miles away from your storage space, so you spend the whole time travelling.
Often, old buses are rescued before the question of storage has been fully considered. let alone solve to any degree of satisfaction. Bus Inspector Ray Bignell recalls the start of the Ribble Bus Preservation Trust.
Well, in the early days it was very hand to mouth. Once they got these 4 or 5 vehicles, they had good relations with a public house near Garstang. This particular one was slightly out in the country and had a very large car park. So they agreed that the buses could be parked there. So they were in the open air. Any maintenance was fairly rudimentary, but they were able to keep them on the road.
Often, preservationists get by with a little help from their friends. Michael Dryhurst.
In those early days, I had a friend named Vic Harvey, and Vic had a very big farm at Hurstfield Point, just the other side of the South Downs from Brighton. The bus was kept under cover in a Dutch farm nearly all the time.
Sometimes, luck is on the side of the preservationist. Dan Shears recalls where his father Colin first kept his Leyland Tiger.
So he had a garage that his father bought for him at the bottom of Pennsylvania Motors. So he used to keep it in there while he was running that business. He sort of lost touch with the business and sort of went into purchasing more vehicles and decided to start the West of England Transport Collection.
Whatever arrangements are made for storage when a vintage bus is first saved, there is one thing on which most serious long-term preservationists agree.
They have to be kept under cover, otherwise it's a total waste of time.
There is no long-term future for bus preservation if you're outdoors. We've seen that. The first 25 years of our group, the vehicles were kept out of doors, and vehicles that had been bought out of service from the independent operator in good condition went downhill very considerably during that period.
Leon Daniels concurs. He recalls the situation facing the London preservation pioneers.
There were enough old buses in private preservation for them to all decide they should pool their resources and try and find a building in which to keep them. Because nearly always these buses were kept outside. So, frankly, the weather did more damage in the Monday to Saturday than they were able to do improvements on the Sunday. So, getting a building together was very important.
Michael Dryhurst was also making longer-term arrangements for the storage of his bus.
I found it a bit of a bind to keep going down to Hurstfield Point every time they wanted to take out the bus. So I wrote to London Transport, and at the time I was writing the Looking on London column for Buses Illustrated, so was dealing constantly with the London Transport Press and Publications Office, although under a pen name B.H. Darling, but they knew who I was, Michael Dryhurst. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I was able to park Fuff in Shepherd's Bush garage for the mammoth amount of £2 a week as long as I did not do any work on it.
Of course, preserved buses do take a lot of work, so the ideal place to keep them is somewhere of your own. But where?
One day, a pioneer preservationist, Dave Hurley, was driving not far from here on the A245 near Cobham when he saw this semi-derelict old building, one of 3 buildings owned by Vickers and used during World War II. Building 45 is the one that became the Cobham Bus Museum.
As Leon explained earlier, the pioneers put their houses and families on the line in order to fund the purchase of the building. It led to some memorable times.
Well, this wonderful building, used by Barnes Wallis during World War II for some of the early work on the bouncing bomb, famous for the dam busters, was simply a storage building, not really suitable for people. Terrible climate. There was a sort of microclimate inside. It was colder inside than outside in the winter, and it was hotter inside than outside in the summer. And it was crammed full of vehicles. Individual owners were working on their vehicles, and once or twice a year we'd clear them all out and invite the public in. It was a great club, if you like, of people all interested in the same thing, working together, doing things together, lots of mutual help, carpenters helping other people, mechanics helping other people, and so on. But pretty well everybody there was an owner or a co-owner, and it was a great place to go, except from the outside you didn't know anything was going on, because you'd go in, close the doors, and all this work, this Aladdin's cave of old vehicles all happening inside.
Cobham Bus Museum wasn't the only former aircraft hangar being used to store old buses. Colin Shears had found the perfect site on which to found the West of England Transport Collection, the old aircraft hangar at Winkley in Devon.
Winkley was used for a pig store, actually. The shed was back in 1965. It came up for sale through the government. So we managed to purchase it from the government in 1965 for £6,500. The shed was quite dilapidated by then because it was Second World War. The roof had got bad. So the first thing they did when they moved here, they put a new roof on the building. He managed to, I think, fill it within 2 years. I think it was just full of buses, and if ever there was a space in there, it would be full within a week. Yeah, there'd be something in there.
For many preserved buses, then and now, rented spaces or leased buildings provide a home. But what do you do with your bus collection if you're given notice to vacate? It's a situation that has faced many over the years, including Ray and the Ribble Group.
We were told we had to quit in order to have the site redeveloped. It was one of those really radical moments when you were forced to face up to the reality of what to do. We had a get-together of all the key people, and we agreed that we were going to do everything in our power to buy our premises. So in effect, it was the catalyst to get us to really get to grips with the core of the problem, which was to buy our own premises.
For the Ribble Bus Preservation Trust, the outcome was a good one.
We were very fortunate that at a critical point where we needed to do the deal on buying the first half of the building, there were two of us who were able to come up with the £80,000 that were needed to buy the first half of the building. Now, unless you're very fortunate, there aren't many groups can simply get that kind of money out of thin air. So the end result is that we have two buildings, two sets of vehicle lifts. We've got a forklift, we've got a scissor lift, we've got an air compressor system that goes around the building, we've got modern LED lighting throughout. We've got most things within reason that a professional garage would have.
As organisations grow, their needs evolve, and despite the success story of Cobham Bus Museum, it became clear that new premises were needed for the collection. Leon Daniels.
We spent a lot of time trying to look after the building, but frankly, when the site was sold, and it's now a residential care home, the building wasn't demolished, it fell down. Very little of the structural supports were still actually connected to the ground, other than by gravity, and the first time they touched it with the digger, it sort of fell over really. So, good thing we moved. Where we've moved to now, on the site at Brooklands, we are side by side with aircraft, vintage cars, motorcycling. We're alongside the finishing straight and the famous banked circuit here at Brooklands. So the buses now are in context. Now they're with other forms of transport. And because Brooklands is an amazing family destination, we have moved from being a shed full of old buses and all of us working on them. We're now a fully working museum with a shop and a kids area and an exhibition area and all the things you'd expect in a modern, up-to-date museum.
The subject of where to keep old buses remains a live and active issue for many museums and collections across the UK. The Eastern Transport Collection has recently risen to the challenge of vacating premises where their buses have been stored for more than 30 years and are now settling into their smart new facility in East Anglia. Groups such as the Northern National Restoration Group in the North East are currently appealing for funds to buy their premises. As we continue the discussion, if you'd like to feature in a future episode of the Bus Inspectors podcast, please get in touch via our socials. The Bus Inspectors project to grade the nation's 10,000 historic buses and coaches has been warmly received.
We are so pleased about this because whenever for example, you're applying for external funding, like with the Heritage Lottery Fund, but any funding, you're always limited as to how much you can say. They want 200 words maximum. And to try and prove the value to the community and the world at large for this particular piece of funding, for this particular vehicle, is very hard to do in 200 words. Now just imagine there's a definitive list of all of these vehicles, and they've been graded on that very basis. Graded on their part in the story, to what extent they're unique, the particular period of history that is important. Let's pretend all that work was done. Now, instead of trying to persuade any external funder that your project is a worthwhile one, now you only have to say, this is where we are in the NATM list of vehicles that have been graded in such a way that we now only need to use 10 of our 200 words to demonstrate the value to the community and the world at large of our project, and we can use the other 190 words to say something more to make the case more compelling.
NATM, the National Association of Road Transport Museums, is the organisation which is running the project. It consists of more than 100 museums and collections around the UK. Since the grading project was announced, more organisations have joined, and several private owners have come forward to ask for their collections to be included as the project progresses. New volunteers have also stepped up to join the bus inspectors. Ray Bignell is leading the project.
We've gone from a team of 7 or 8 volunteers to 18, and that's given us the opportunity to make sure that every visit is done by 2 people, which we've decided is the absolute minimum you need to do justice to the subject.
Those visits are now underway. The bus inspectors are working closely with museums, curators and vehicle owners to develop a deep understanding of each vehicle and record what is significant about each one.
The later Dominators never had that. This is more like a half cab style.
There are detailed conversations about history.
When 30-foot double-deckers came out in 1956, this was a relatively early one, and certainly Leicester's first ones.
The operational life of each vehicle.
The bloke in control could see what buses were because of the fleet numbers on the roof, call the bus up and ask it to go to a stand.
Technical tour.
The Leicester's had Gardner engines, whereas the South Yorkshire ones were Rolls-Royce.
Oh, right.
Oh, right.
Discussions about restoration.
When we got that, tree damage, dome damage, where we've made it back out of aluminium, painted it white as it should be, and put the vents back in.
Even the political context of the vehicle.
I suppose the design was that Metro Camel were worried about not having a bus chassis from Leyland.
In recording data for grading, one of the considerations for the bus inspectors is the vehicle's authenticity. This is not about counting rivets or making judgments about the quality of restorations. It's about how faithfully the vehicle tells the story of all the different things it represents. There are several complex measures of authenticity, but one aspect is particularly thorny. Bus Inspector Paul Statham.
Just suppose, instead of buses, we were scoring ancient monuments, and one of them was Stonehenge, right? But somebody's painted it blue.
The livery of a bus or coach is a surprisingly emotive subject. It's a big part of the vehicle's identity and is often what is most clearly remembered.
This big green-fronted bus with the white roof. For some reason, I remember distinctly knowing that these buses were Mercedes buses and thinking that it was so cool.
Broadcaster Sally Reeves. Livery includes the colour scheme, right down to the particular shades.
I'll always remember that vivid green of the plucky little Western Greyhound buses.
How those colours are applied.
We would then be sat on the wall at the beach waiting for this white roof to reappear.
And the style and position of any logos and lettering you might see on the vehicle.
With the Greyhound logo running across the side of it as well.
Most historic buses and coaches have carried a number of different liveries during their working lives. Bus Inspector Simon Gill remembers the many changes in Leicester.
This PD3 carried 3 different liveries. When they were delivered in 1958, Leicester had a predominantly maroon livery with cream window surrounds. Then it changed in 1961 to a pale cream livery with 3 maroon bands or crimson bands. And then in 1968 they changed to a deeper cream, which this now represents, with 2 maroon bands, so they got rid of the top maroon band.
In preservation, almost all buses and coaches have been repainted, some several times. Major restorations will almost certainly include a full repaint, meaning the livery is a transient feature of the bus. So in terms of grading for the longer term, does the current livery really matter? For Leon Daniels and the London Bus Museum, it's a philosophical matter.
I think telling the story and putting it in context is more important than whether the livery is strictly appropriate. And I would always stick out to say, let's tell as much of the story as possible, rather than to be more technically accurate and have to the public, similar looking vehicles in identical colours.
Some purists may disagree, but Leon offers a compelling example of the philosophy in action. The London Bus Museum's recently restored 1925 Dennis D142.
When Prince Marshall secured it, it was in the red livery of General. We already have on it display here S454, which is a red open-top General liveried bus. And we decided we were going to have D142 in the livery of the London Public Omnibus Company. Well, there are those people who think it should be red. But we painted it blue because, as part of telling a story of the history of London buses, we wanted the pirate bus operators, pre-1930s, we wanted the pirate bus operators to be represented. We decided to paint it in the London Public Omnibus livery because it helped tell the story.
Whilst hugely important to our experience of a bus or coach, the current livery is a small consideration in a much bigger picture for the bus inspectors.
The NARTM scheme helps to give us some sense of scale and proportion. And I think if we look at this with a cold flannel on our heads, we will realise that we have to prioritise. I've been involved in traffic engineering and highway engineering as well as public transport and so on when I was at Transport for London. We had to have a basis on which to make value for money decisions. And at the end of the day, there's a social value, there's a cost, and preservation will have to face this. And I know people will say absolutely everything should be preserved at all costs, but frankly it's not going to be possible in the future. As our interests change, as the interests of the people that follow us and the people that follow them change, not everything is going to be able to be saved. And that's why I think the NARTM grading scheme is so hugely important, because the first time it's lifting the lid of something none of us have dared talk about so far.
Our preservation pioneers could hardly have imagined the extensive national collection we have today.
I can see Alan looking down and saying, all that empty space. He said, I'd fill up all that space. I get twice as many buses in there. So he was a man of his time and delivered what was delivered then. And we are people of our time delivering what we need now.
I think because of Dad, it's just in the blood. And I really, really enjoy my weekends here.
The fact there is a fully fledged, accredited museum open to the public, thousands of people visiting here every year, I think would be beyond his wildest dreams. And for that reason, when he'd finished huffing and puffing about how things would have been different under his regime, he'd be just quietly very proud.
And despite the bus has been sold many times since then, nobody's ever bothered to repay me my bloody £2.10.
Next time on the Bus Inspectors podcast, the issue of duplication.
There are something like 1,600 route masters out of the 2,893 built.
And the ones that got away.
I'm thinking particularly of the first Bristol Low-Decker, which should never have been scrapped.
Follow us in the meantime on Facebook, X, YouTube, Insta and Threads, and at thebusinspectors.com. The Bus Inspectors podcast was presented and produced by me, David Sheppard. Our guests were Leon Daniels, OBE, Michael Dryhurst, Dan Shears, Sally Reeves, Ray Bignell, Simon Gill and Gherkin. Special thanks to volunteers and members of the London Bus Museum and Leicester Transport Heritage Trust, and to all those museums and collections visited by the bus inspectors so far. The Bus Inspectors podcast was brought to you by the National Association of Road Transport Museums.